I swear I will never again go near the railroad tracks. Yet, deep down, I am convinced that dying under the wheels of a train is my destiny. I feel that, one way or another, it will happen. My recent encounter with the Switchman is unlikely to be the last. It seems that my troubled face caught his interest somehow. This story began back in my youth, when I lived in a small town with a population of 17,000 people, where almost everyone you passed on the street was someone you knew. There were 3 schools in the town, and I was fortunate to attend the first gymnasium, which was considered the best. I must admit, studying wasn't easy, but I made an effort to be diligent. At school, I had a classmate named Alice, a pretty girl with bright red hair and rare amber-colored eyes. I liked her, but not in a romantic way. To me, falling in love with a classmate felt as strange as falling in love with a sister. Alice and I had been together since first grade. I still remembered her as a little toothless girl, with oversized bows tied in her hair on that Parents' Day, so big that it seemed she might be swept away by the wind to some magical land. Alice and I were like family, and our friendship felt like something inevitable, like it was simply meant to be. Of course, we had our quarrels, but after a while, we would always make up. It's hard to share a classroom and hold a grudge for long when funny things keep happening all the time. It's impossible to stay mad. Sometimes after school, we would wander the streets, go to the movies, or visit the park. Then I would walk her to the bus stop because she lived in a village a few kilometers away from our town. One day, we lost track of time while hanging out, and before we knew it, the last bus had left. "Damn it," Alice said, glancing at her watch. "It's already 5:30. How could I miss the bus? Do you have money for a taxi?" "I can chip in a little," I offered, feeling guilty. "No need, I'll walk." "It's only about 40 minutes on foot," Alice replied, as if she didn't sense any danger. "You going to walk alone across the empty fields?" I asked, surprised. "Yep," Alice said casually. She set off that evening, and no one ever saw her again. "Let's go together. You can show me your village," I suggested, thinking it might be an interesting adventure. "And then you'll walk back alone?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, sure. You're the one who talked me into it," I said jokingly. Alice smiled, clearly pleased, and we started our journey. First, we descended a steep hill covered in dry grass, then made our way through wild areas with towering trees, and finally ended up on a dusty road running alongside a field of ripening sunflowers. "Want some seeds?" Alice offered. "Are we even allowed to take them?" I asked hesitantly. "Oh, come on, just pick some. No one will miss them," she said confidently, plucking the drooping head of the nearest sunflower. The sun was still high in the sky as we walked, chatting and snacking on sunflower seeds. They were nothing like the ones from the store. The shells were soft, and the kernels were raw and tasteless, but for some reason, I liked them. The whole spontaneous journey felt like an exciting adventure. I was mentally calculating whether I'd make it back to town before dark so my parents wouldn't start worrying about my absence. With every step, I grew used to the terrain, even as tiny gravel stones pressed painfully against the thin soles of my sneakers. Throughout the entire journey along this desolate edge of the countryside, we didn't encounter a single soul. We came out to the railroad tracks and started walking straight ahead. "Just 20 more minutes, and the village begins," Alice said cheerfully, adjusting her backpack. Ahead of us, the tracks stretched out, disappearing into the darkness. "Let's race across it," she suggested, and in no time, we were on the other side. The tunnel was only about 10 meters long. "Afraid of the dark, huh?" I asked as we slowed our pace. "No," Alice replied, "it's just dangerous here. People get hit by trains in this spot. My neighbor's aunt died here recently." If you come back this way, be careful. Don't worry. You can hear a train from a kilometer away, and I've got no hearing problems, I assured her, unable to imagine how careless someone would have to be to end up under a train. Besides, there's nowhere to hide in the tunnel, it's pretty narrow. Why would anyone even go in if they can hear the rumble and feel the ground shaking? The main thing is to avoid running into the switchman here, Alice said, almost jokingly. What, am I supposed to be scared of the switchman? I asked, picturing some grumpy old guy in a blue work jacket and an orange safety vest. Isn't that profession outdated? All railways should be automated by now. Hard to believe there are still people walking around pulling levers on tracks. No, I mean a different kind of switchman. Haven't you heard? There's a creepy story about him, Alice said, her tone inviting me to ask her to tell it. Like most boys, I loved creepy legends, and a story tied to a specific place. That was pure gold. Of course, I wanted to hear it. As we kept walking, I glanced back at the dark opening of the tunnel. Many people had died under its arch, a place like that was bound to have a sinister tale attached to it. The switchman is a man who's been cut in half, Alice said, lowering her voice to build the atmosphere. His legs run around separately or what? I tried to imagine it, raising an eyebrow. No, not lengthwise, she said. He's split across the middle, between his right and left halves, like a train sliced him in two. Alice traced a line from her forehead down to her chin with her finger. Don't demonstrate on yourself, I said with a hint of irony, not being superstitious. So, what's his deal, this switchman? Alice shrugged. They say he lures people onto the tracks when a train is coming, or something like that. Why? I asked, glancing back again. Well, probably just because he's evil, Alice replied. Does he have some kind of backstory or motivation? I tried to get more details. Who is he? Where did he come from? Why does he take it out on people? No, my friend said. He's just some scary figure. A ghost of the railroad. Maybe he was a switchman who got run over by a train. Boring, I said, disappointed. Then make up a backstory for him yourself, Alice suggested. Who do you think he is? Well, let's say he's undead, I began, letting my imagination take over. In the forest, you have the leshy, in the water, the vodyanoi, and on the railroad, you have the switchman. Like all undead, he needs sacrifices. Blood and chilling rumors keep him alive. He needs people to believe in him, or he'll disappear. The tunnel is his temple of sacrifices. You've got quite the imagination, Alice said with a smile. You should write horror stories. Do you believe in the switchman? I asked sarcastically. Of course not, Alice replied. But if I'm ever walking through the tunnel, I always think about him. She smirked. It's probably just one of those superstitions, like a black cat crossing your path. We walked down the street, lined on both sides with charming houses and colorful picket fences. In some yards, dogs barked incessantly, while curious cats perched near gates, watching the world go by. Elderly women sat on benches, chatting or simply enjoying the quiet evening. Alice greeted everyone we passed, as was customary, otherwise, people would think you were rude. I joined in for the sake of company, chiming in with a cheerful, "Good evening, everyone." We reached her house, and I realized that Alice lived quite well. Her home was spacious, unlike my tiny room. Alice's mom invited me in for tea, but I declined, explaining that it was time for me to head back. I wasn't keen on walking home alone in the dark. The sun was already dipping behind the treetops, and the first chill of evening nipped at my fingers and ears. I said goodbye to Alice and set off, trying to recall all the turns we had taken. The way back didn't feel as long, and before I knew it, I found myself once again by the railroad tracks. The grass around me rustled softly, and even a light breeze sent shivers down my spine. Ahead, the tunnel loomed dark and foreboding. By now, I had forgotten the story about the Switchman. It seemed far more likely to encounter some shady people there. After all, the beer bottles scattered around hadn't appeared out of thin air. But under the bridge, it was eerily quiet. Relieved, I confidently began walking along the tracks. Then, suddenly, I froze at the tunnel's exit. At first glance, it was clear that this was no ordinary person. He was unnaturally tall, about 3 meters, and his silhouette was shrouded in darkness. But the most striking feature was the deep, straight gash running from the top of his head down to his midsection. The wound stood out as a stark black line. I froze in terror, realizing that I was face to face with the Switchman. He stood between the rails, long and thin, like a pillar jutting out of the earth. Then, suddenly, the giant's body opened up, like a book, slowly splitting apart along that gruesome wound. Inside, I saw his organs, the left and right hemispheres of his brain, his beating heart, his expanding lungs, and his pulsing intestines. All of it was intact, as if the split had only affected the outer layer of his flesh. The giant stretched his arms toward me, long and thin, like the rails themselves. His hands opened, not to touch, but as if inviting me into his embrace. I struggled to take a deep breath, trying to force myself out of my paralysis. Then, suddenly, the tracks beneath my feet began to tremble. Behind me, the noise grew louder. It was a train, and it was getting closer. I couldn't run toward the giant. My only option was to run back, toward the roar of the approaching train. The locomotive hurtled toward the tunnel, growing larger with every second, transforming into a massive iron beast. Its deafening horn hit me like a gust of wind. I will never forget that moment. The first time I nearly lost my life. That heat from the train, the blinding light, the smell of tar and motor oil, that could have been my death. I managed to jump out of the tunnel a split second before the roaring train thundered through. I tumbled down the rocky slope into thorny bushes, scraping my hands and face, bruising my knee, and tearing my school blazer. But I was alive. I was lucky. The train sped away, leaving behind only its fading rumble and the trembling air. Most likely, the engineer had no idea he'd almost run someone over. I crawled out of the thorny bushes, feeling the sting of scratches all over my body, and looked up at the railroad. The split giant was still there, peering out of the tunnel. His enormous silhouette, like a sinister hammer, loomed threateningly, capable of destroying anyone caught off guard. I could have been gone, reduced to nothing more than bloody fragments smeared across the tracks. And now the giant was gazing down at me, regretful that he hadn't claimed a new soul for himself. I took a detour through the thorny undergrowth, desperate to get away from that cursed place and make it home. Alice must have sensed my distant, distracted mood the moment she saw me at school, but she didn't pester me with questions. Instead, she waited until recess and suggested we step outside for some fresh air. When we stepped into the courtyard, Alice pulled a plastic container out of her backpack. "My mom made this for us," she said. "She told me to share it with you for walking me home yesterday." She opened the lid, revealing sandwiches filled with ham, tomatoes, and lettuce. "Thanks," I said, taking one, though I had no appetite. "How did you get home? You didn't get lost, did you?" Alice asked, taking a bite of her sandwich. "Alice," I began, "you shouldn't walk through that tunnel anymore. I nearly got hit by a train last night." Hearing this, she choked a little and started coughing. "You're such an idiot. And you said you had no problems with your hearing," she said with a smile. I patted her on the back as she caught her breath. "That's not the point," I countered. "The Switchman was there. is the reason I almost died. Promise me you'll never go through that tunnel again." I tried to sound as serious as possible so she would take my words to heart. Alice stopped chewing and looked at me with her cheeks still puffed out. "What? The Switchman? That ghost from the scary story? Are you telling me?" She didn't believe me, even though she had been the one to tell me the creepy legend. "Yes, that one," I nodded. "And what did he look like?" Alice asked. 3 meters tall, split in half, and absolutely terrifying," I replied. "Much scarier than the way you described him. He's not just a ghost, he's some kind of soul collector." "Dima, you've got a bump on your forehead. Did you hit your head? What if it's a concussion?" Alice asked, concerned, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "I don't have a concussion," I snapped, jumping up from the bench. "Listen to what I'm telling you. Never go through that tunnel again. Can you promise me that or not?" Alice tilted her head up and looked at me from below. All right, don't get mad. I get it, I promise. You've scared me like I'm a little kid," she said with a half smile. We never brought up the topic again. Alice didn't ask any more questions, understanding that the experience had left a heavy mark on me. And I, too, wanted to forget it as soon as possible. I wanted to, but I couldn't. Rumors of people dying on the railroad tracks kept haunting me. One particularly shocking incident was when a train hit several young guys at once. The event was cynically dubbed the Meat Fountain. It happened the following year, in the very same spot. Witnesses claimed they saw the train plunge into the tunnel and emerge covered in blood, scattering arms, legs, and heads in all directions. Some people even turned the site into a hangout spot. "Idiots don't survive, it's natural selection," remarked those who had heard about it. I think people used this cruelty as a way to shield themselves from the tragedy, as if being overly cautious could somehow protect them from every danger in the world. They probably would have said the same about me: "Got hit by a train. Your own fault." I kept having similar nightmares, each with different but equally hopeless endings. In every one, I found myself back in the dark tunnel, vividly sensing the smells of oil, rust, and dust. The tunnel was narrower but longer than in reality. I would walk through it, only to encounter the severed switchman, and behind me, the rumble of an approaching train would grow louder. I'd start running back, stumbling over the ties. In one version of the dream, I was a second too late to escape. The raging train would smash my body like a balloon filled with water, and I'd wake up in a cold sweat, trembling. In another, I managed to reach the light, but the switchman's long hand would grab my leg and drag me back, where the train's wheels would crush me, tearing my body apart, ripping off my head. 15 years have passed since then. The years flew by unnoticed, and now I'm no longer a schoolboy, nor even a student, but a man in his 30s with a beard and a mortgage. It's hard to believe that all of this happened to me. But I have to be grateful. My life could have ended a long time ago. Now I live in a different city. Alice and I haven't spoken since our high school graduation. At one time, it seemed like our friendship would last forever, but our paths diverged, and neither of us looked back, a typical story of adult life. Strange dreams haunted me until the end of high school. It was only when I left for college that they miraculously stopped. I don't know if it was the change of scenery, a new life, or simply the fact that I'd put some distance between myself and the switchman. Still, I remember that during summer breaks, when I visited my parents in my hometown, the old nightmares would sometimes resurface. Returning to those memories was hard for me, which is probably why I chose to stay in my new city and try to move on, as if none of it had ever happened. Or maybe it did, but in some other universe. All that remained from the past were my fears. Since then, I've never traveled by train or commuter rail. Their rumble triggers panic in me, as if pulling me back to that dreadful day. Each time, I feel it all over again, as if it's happening in the present moment. Even though that event is now just a memory, I've always avoided railroads. The image of the split giant, years later, feels like a nightmarish vision that refuses to fade. The Switchman. He couldn't have existed in reality, could he? It would be easy to attribute everything to the emotional shock of almost being hit by a train or the trauma of the fall. But I distinctly remembered seeing the tall, emaciated figure first, and only after that did I flee from the locomotive. Although memory is unreliable, they say it's unstable, and over the years, we can recall events that never even happened. I wasn't sure whether I could trust my own mind, but my body never lied. Every time I approached railroad tracks, I froze. I could feel the cold I experienced that night, the chill of bad weather, the wind carrying the weight of a massive train barreling down on me, and the presence of the Switchman, paralyzing me, holding me in place, and then forcing me to flee. So many years have passed, yet I still avoid going near railroads, just in case. The fear still lingers in my heart, taking the shape of a 3-meter-tall man with a deep wound running the length of his body. It feels as though he's always been there, like a shadow lurking in the depths of my memories, waiting for the day he might reappear. Recently, one evening, I was walking home from the outskirts of the city after meeting up with some friends. Taxi prices had skyrocketed lately, so I decided to save money and walk instead. Besides, a stroll was good for me, especially since October had been warm and dry. I enjoy evening walks, breathing in the crisp air, catching the scents of fallen leaves, and gazing at the rare stars partially hidden by clouds. Memories of the night lingered in my mind. It had been a pleasant time. I was lucky to have found people as boring as me, those who enjoy board games and quiet conversations. The quiet outskirts were cloaked in darkness, with the distant lights of the city center glowing ahead. I had never walked this way before and didn't realize the path from the forest park crossed a railway. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal, just take 2 steps and move on. But as soon as I saw the smooth steel rails, my phobia kicked in. My chest felt hot, my breathing quickened, and my pulse surged in panic. Just get across, I thought. But the slabs on the tracks were uneven, and there was a gap between them into which my foot slipped, sinking up to the ankle. I jerked sharply and realized that my foot was completely stuck, as if caught in a trap. The gap between the rubber slabs revealed only black emptiness, swallowing my shoe entirely. It was as if the darkness itself had consumed my foot. Even before I heard the faint rumble in the distance, a fire of terror ignited within me. Help! I shouted at the top of my lungs, yanking my leg and ignoring the pain. Someone help me! But no one heard me, just as I couldn't hear any other voices. It was night. The forest park was silent except for the soft rustle of fallen leaves blown by the wind. I was completely alone. Hardly anyone ever passed through this place, especially at night. And then, somewhere in the darkness, I heard the train's horn. I realized that an unstoppable machine of death was bearing down on me, and if I didn't do something, it would be the end of me. There wouldn't even be enough left of my body to piece together. I'd be scattered among the gravel and oil. I screamed until my throat was raw, tears streaming down my face from sheer terror and despair. It was impossible to free my foot. Even by trying to abandon my shoe, I was completely stuck. I yanked my leg again and again, tearing the skin down to the flesh, as the train rounded the bend and its headlights pierced the darkness. In the very last moment, I pulled with every ounce of strength I had, and with a sickening crunch, my foot came free from the gap. I collapsed onto my back, then scrambled backward, away from the tracks. In the next moment, the lights of the train rushed past me. Gusts of wind slammed into my face, and flickering light danced in my eyes as the train roared along the tracks and vanished into the darkness. I sat there on the ground, feeling utterly drained. My heart pounded in my chest, mirroring the relentless rhythm of the iron wheels. Finally, after catching my breath, I stood up, feeling a sharp, throbbing pain in my foot. It was probably sprained. But I just wanted to leave as quickly as possible, even if it meant dragging my leg along the ground. And as I limped away, I saw him. Standing in the distance on the tracks, shrouded in a misty haze, was the 3-meter-tall figure. He watched me with a displeased gaze, as though regretting his missed chance. He had waited for this moment for years, waited for me to make a mistake and approach the railroad. But now I understood, he would come for me again. He needed my soul. But I needed more.